In the aftermath of the community debate, the HOA's efforts to foreclose on David's home ground to a halt. Karen, her power base crumbling, found herself increasingly isolated, her once loyal board members distancing themselves from her increasingly erratic behavior. With the legal threat lifted, David and his family were finally able to focus on repairing the damage to their solar panels. It was a daunting task, but with the support of their neighbors and the newfound goodwill of the community, they were able to get the system up and running again. As the panels hummed to life, casting a warm glow over the rooftop, David felt a sense of profound relief wash over him. The nightmare was finally over, and his family's financial security had been preserved. But the experience had left its mark, both physically and emotionally. The stress of the ordeal had taken a toll on David's health, and he found himself struggling with anxiety and insomnia. His wife, too, bore the scars of the battle, her once ebullient spirit dampened by the fear and uncertainty they had endured. Still, the family pressed on, determined to rebuild their lives and reclaim a sense of normalcy. With the HOA's grip on the community loosened, they began to reach out to their neighbors, forging new connections and finding strength in the bonds of community. And as the weeks and months passed, something remarkable began to happen. The solar panels, once the source of so much strife, became a symbol of the community's resilience and determination. Neighbors who had once scoffed at the idea of renewable energy now marveled at the panels, their curiosity piqued by the promise of a more sustainable future. For David and his family, the victory was bittersweet. They had fought so hard to save their home, to protect their way of life, that the simple act of enjoying their own backyard felt like a hard-won luxury. But as they looked out over the gleaming panels, they knew that their struggle had been worth it. In the end, the battle with Karen and the HOA had not just saved their home. It had forged a new sense of community, a shared understanding that progress and empathy could go hand in hand. And as David gazed out at the neighborhood, he knew that the fight was far from over, but that he and his family were ready to take on whatever the future might hold. Determined to find a resolution, David decided to take his case to the Homeowners Association. Surely, the HOA would see reason and intervene on his behalf. As he approached the imposing front door of the HOA headquarters, however, he felt a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. The meeting was a disaster from the start. Karen, ever the skilled manipulator, had already planted the seeds of doubt in the minds of the HOA board members. She painted David as an obstinate troublemaker, a threat to the well-being of the entire neighborhood. "He's ruining the aesthetic," Karen screeched, her voice shrill and accusatory. "Those panels are an eyesore, and they're bringing down our property values." David tried to plead his case, to show the board the damage to his solar array and explain the financial implications, but his words fell on deaf ears. The HOA president, a stern-faced woman named Margaret, raised a hand to silence him. "We have clear guidelines about the appearance of homes in this community," she said, her tone unyielding. "I'm afraid we have no choice but to side with Mrs. Peterson on this matter." David's heart sank as the board members nodded in agreement. He could see it in their eyes. They had already made up their minds, and there was nothing he could do to change it. As he walked home, his mind racing, David knew he couldn't give up. This wasn't just about the solar panels. It was about standing up for what was right, about defending his family's future. Determined, he decided to take his case to the local news, hoping to shine a light on the injustice of the HOA's decision. The following day, a reporter from the city's leading news station arrived at David's doorstep, her cameraman in tow. David poured his heart out, detailing the confrontation with Karen and the HOA's refusal to hear his side of the story. The resulting news segment was a bombshell, exposing the HOA's heavy-handed tactics and Karen's vindictive behavior. Viewers were outraged, flooding the HOA's phone lines and social media pages with angry demands for a fair hearing. But even as the public outcry grew, David knew that the battle was far from over. Karen was a formidable opponent, and the HOA was firmly in her corner. As the tension mounted, he braced himself for the next round of the fight, determined to protect his family's home at all costs. The media attention had stirred up a hornet's nest, and the fallout was swift and unforgiving. Within days, David found himself summoned to an emergency HOA meeting, where Karen and her allies on the board were waiting, their faces twisted with barely concealed fury. "You've made a mockery of this community." Margaret, the HOA president, thundered, her eyes narrowed to slits. "This kind of publicity is unacceptable. You're in violation of our bylaws, and we have no choice but to take action." David tried to interject, to explain his side of the story, but the board members were having none of it. They had clearly made up their minds, and they were determined to use every tool at their disposal to crush his resistance. "We're fining you $10,000 for your unauthorized solar panels," Margaret declared, her voice dripping with disdain. "And if you don't remove them within the next 30 days, we'll have them taken down at your expense." David's heart sank as the weight of the board's decision sank in. $10,000 was a crippling sum, one that would put his family's financial stability at risk. And the prospect of losing his solar panels, the linchpin of their renewable energy system, was utterly devastating. Sensing his distress, Karen leaned forward, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "And if you don't pay the fine," she purred, "we'll foreclose on your home." David left the meeting in a daze, his mind reeling. He knew that he couldn't back down, not when so much was at stake. But the prospect of losing everything, his home, his family's security, the hard-won progress they had made towards financial independence, was almost too much to bear. As he walked back to his house, David felt a surge of anger coursing through him. This wasn't just about solar panels anymore. It was about the abuse of power, the corruption that had infected the very heart of his community, and he knew that he couldn't let it stand. Steeling his resolve, David decided to take his fight to the next level. He would challenge the HOA's decision in court, leveraging every legal resource at his disposal to protect his family's home. It would be a long and arduous battle, but he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The legal battle was a grueling slog, filled with endless motions, depositions, and courtroom showdowns. David poured every ounce of his energy and resources into the fight, determined to expose the HOA's corrupt practices and protect his family's home. Karen, of course, was not about to go down without a fight. She enlisted the help of a high-powered attorney, a slick-talking litigator who seemed to have the judge in his pocket. Time and time again, the HOA's legal team managed to stall proceedings, delay rulings, and erect roadblocks at every turn. But David refused to be cowed. He dug in, researching obscure bylaws and precedents, scouring for any angle that might give him an edge. And slowly, painstakingly, he began to chip away at the HOA's carefully constructed facade of legitimacy. One day, during a particularly heated deposition, David stumbled upon a bombshell. Evidence that the HOA had been funneling community funds into the personal accounts of its board members. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom, and suddenly, the tide began to turn. As the case dragged on, the media attention only grew. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, eager to cover the latest developments in the saga. David's story had struck a chord with the public, who were outraged by the HOA's blatant abuse of power and the threat to his family's home. Karen, sensing the shifting winds, grew increasingly frantic. She lashed out at David, hurling insults and threats, even going so far as to vandalize his property in the dead of night. But David refused to be cowed, his resolve only hardening with each new challenge. Finally, after months of grueling legal battles, the judge rendered his verdict. The HOA's actions were deemed unlawful, and the $10,000 fine was overturned. David had won a decisive victory, but the cost had been high. His family's savings had been drained, and the stress had taken a heavy toll on his mental and physical health. As David and his family celebrated their hard-won triumph, they knew that the war was far from over. Karen and her cronies on the HOA board were not about to give up without a fight, and with the threat of foreclosure still looming, David knew that he had to be prepared for the next round of the battle. With the legal victory under his belt, David thought he could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But the respite was short-lived, as Karen and the HOA board immediately launched a new offensive, this time targeting his family's home directly. Within days, a notice of foreclosure arrived in the mail, citing a litany of minor code violations that David had never been informed about. The HOA was demanding immediate action, threatening to seize the property if the issues were not addressed within 30 days. Stunned, David pored over the documents, his heart racing. The violations were trivial: a cracked driveway, a peeling patch of paint, a broken porch light. Things that he had been meaning to fix but had not yet had the time or resources to address. Knowing that he was being railroaded, David sprang into action. He reached out to his lawyer, who immediately filed a motion to halt the foreclosure proceedings. But the HOA's legal team was relentless, using every trick in the book to delay and obstruct the process. As the 30-day deadline loomed, David found himself in a race against time, scrambling to address the code violations while simultaneously fighting the foreclosure in court. The stress was overwhelming, and his family could feel the tension in the air, the sense of impending doom. Then, one night, as David was working late into the evening to complete the necessary repairs, disaster struck. The power went out, plunging the house into darkness. Cursing under his breath, David grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, only to discover that his solar panels had been systematically sabotaged, the wiring severed, the panels themselves smashed beyond repair. Reeling from the discovery, David knew that he was facing a losing battle. Without the solar panels, his family's energy savings were gone, leaving them vulnerable to the foreclosure proceedings. And with the HOA seemingly willing to resort to any tactic to drive them out, he feared that even completing the code violations might not be enough to save their home. Dejected, David retreated to the house, his mind racing with dread and uncertainty. As his wife and children gathered around him, he knew that he had to make a decision, one that would determine the fate of their family for years to come. With the foreclosure deadline looming and his solar panels in ruins, David knew that he had to act fast. Desperate and out of options, he decided to take the fight directly to Karen and the HOA board. Gathering his family, he laid out his plan. A bold, high-stakes gambit that would either save their home or send them spiraling into ruin. His wife, initially hesitant, eventually agreed that they had no choice but to go all in. The next day, David marched into the HOA headquarters, his jaw set with determination. Karen and the board members were waiting for him, their faces twisted with a mixture of triumph and thinly veiled glee. "So, you finally come to your senses," Karen sneered, her tone dripping with condescension. "Are you ready to admit defeat and hand over the keys?" David held up a hand, silencing her. "Not so fast, Karen," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I've got a proposal for you." Taken aback, the board members exchanged puzzled glances. David seized the moment, laying out his plan in meticulous detail. A public debate, a showdown of sorts, where he would present his case to the entire community. "If I can convince the residents that my solar panels are an asset, not an eyesore, then you have to drop the foreclosure proceedings," David declared, his eyes narrowing. "But if I fail, I'll remove the panels and pay the fine without a fight." Karen's expression shifted from confusion to outrage, and for a moment, David thought she might refuse outright. But then, a calculating gleam entered her eyes, and she leaned back in her chair, a smug smile spreading across her face. "Fine, David," she said, her voice dripping with false magnanimity. "We'll give you your little debate. But when you lose, don't come crawling back to us, begging for mercy." David left the HOA headquarters with a mixture of trepidation and cautious optimism. He knew that he was taking a huge risk, but the stakes were too high to back down. If he could sway the community, he might just be able to save his family's home. As the date of the debate approached, David poured his heart and soul into his preparations, determined to leave no stone unturned. He studied the solar industry, researched the benefits of renewable energy, and rehearsed his arguments until they were second nature. And when the day finally arrived, he stepped onto the makeshift stage, his family at his side, ready to fight for their future. The community center was packed to the brim, the air thick with anticipation. Karen and the HOA board members sat on one side of the room, their faces set in a mask of grim determination. On the other side, David's supporters, a motley crew of neighbors, environmental activists, and concerned citizens, waited with bated breath. As David stepped up to the microphone, he could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. This wasn't just about his family's home. It was about the very soul of the community, the battle between progress and stagnation, between empathy and greed. With a deep breath, he launched into his presentation, his voice strong and confident. He talked about the benefits of solar power, the ways it could save families money and reduce their carbon footprint. He debunked the myths about property values, showing how renewable energy actually increased the desirability of homes. Karen and the HOA board members sat in stony silence, their arms crossed, as David laid out his case with meticulous detail. But as the minutes ticked by, David could see the mood in the room shifting. The audience, once skeptical, began to nod along, their expressions softening. When David finally concluded his remarks, the room erupted in applause. Stunned, Karen rose to her feet, her face contorted with rage. "This is an outrage," she shrieked, her voice cutting through the din. "Those panels are an eyesore, and they're bringing down our property values." But her words fell on deaf ears. The audience, emboldened by David's impassioned plea, began to shout her down, voicing their support for his cause. Even some of the HOA board members looked uneasy, their facade of confidence beginning to crack. In the end, the vote was decisive. The community overwhelmingly rejected the HOA's plan to foreclose on David's home. Karen, her face a mask of fury, stormed out of the room, with the rest of the board members trailing behind her. As the cheers died down, David turned to his family, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. They had won, not just the battle, but the war. And in that moment, he knew that their home, their hard-won sanctuary, was safe. In the aftermath of the community debate, the HOA's efforts to foreclose on David's home ground to a halt. Karen, her power base crumbling, found herself increasingly isolated, her once loyal board members distancing themselves from her increasingly erratic behavior. With the legal threat lifted, David and his family were finally able to focus on repairing the damage to their solar panels. It was a daunting task, but with the support of their neighbors and the newfound goodwill of the community, they were able to get the system up and running again. As the panels hummed to life, casting a warm glow over the rooftop, David felt a sense of profound relief wash over him. The nightmare was finally over, and his family's financial security had been preserved. But the experience had left its mark, both physically and emotionally. The stress of the ordeal had taken a toll on David's health, and he found himself struggling with anxiety and insomnia. His wife, too, bore the scars of the battle, her once ebullient spirit dampened by the fear and uncertainty they had endured. Still, the family pressed on, determined to rebuild their lives and reclaim a sense of normalcy. With the HOA's grip on the community loosened, they began to reach out to their neighbors, forging new connections and finding strength in the bonds of community. And as the weeks and months passed, something remarkable began to happen. The solar panels, once the source of so much strife, became a symbol of the community's resilience and determination. Neighbors who had once scoffed at the idea of renewable energy now marveled at the panels, their curiosity piqued by the promise of a more sustainable future. For David and his family, the victory was bittersweet. They had fought so hard to save their home, to protect their way of life, that the simple act of enjoying their own backyard felt like a hard-won luxury. But as they looked out over the gleaming panels, they knew that their struggle had been worth it. In the end, the battle with Karen and the HOA had not just saved their home. It had forged a new sense of community, a shared understanding that progress and empathy could go hand in hand. And as David gazed out at the neighborhood, he knew that the fight was far from over, but that he and his family were ready to take on whatever the future might hold.